Hey, we are starting in Exodus chapter 16. Last week, the song. This week, well, the complaints start, right? You know, everybody was joyful, and now they are frustrated. I don't know. Have you ever been part of a church before? Maybe this is not so hard to understand. I'm teasing. Or is it just human nature? No matter where you are. But let me back up. Okay. We're all on an Exodus journey. You hear me say this, but I continue to want to invite you to connect with the story, not just think of it as something that happened a long time ago, but as God has it in the Bible, what happened also happens, or it's happening. And I hope it's happening for you, the Exodus journey. We are connecting it with Genesis, which the rabbis might suggest to you is a prequel. You know, the story that just sets up the big story, which is this, Exodus, that we're in right now. We're connecting God's, even the language, God's intent or purpose, and the words themselves with the creation activity, that God is setting free everything. You know, right now it's winter, things go into a dormant period right now in terms of nature, but when you think about how flowers grow or how trees grow or the fruit of the earth that we eat, it has been set free, or exodus. That's the actual language in the Genesis creation stories, where God is allowing the full potential of life to happen. Are you on that Exodus journey? Are you someone who is open to God's new, recreative, regenerative, Exodus type of energy in your life to bring about the fullness of who God's calling you to be as a daughter of God, as a son of God here in this room? Exodus journey from what? Setting free from evil, selfishness, violent tendencies, injustice, inhumanity, any type of way that we look down our nose upon someone else, or whatever it is that you might be struggling with. God intends for you and I in Christ to be on an Exodus journey. All creation, all creatures, even the universe is expanding. What about you? How about you and I? So God has created everything this way. So may it be for you and I. And I think about the people of God who were the Israelites, the Hebrew people who were enslaved, were set free. Moses, I talked about this, how you could even read a sort of military perspective. It's there. It's in the Scripture. I'm not placing that on the Scripture. Understand Moses as a general. He went up against, with God, absolutely, with God's help and miracles, he went up against the king of Egypt, the superpower of the area of the world at that time, and won the battle. Now, proof in my point here is that Moses, think about what did not happen. It's an amazing fact. Moses just commanded this small group of people, or people who you wouldn't think are elite military type of people, to win a great battle against the superpower. But Moses, Aaron, and the other leaders don't demand more war. Isn't that interesting? In human nature, in human history, throughout time, you hear time and again, if you win a battle, you're kind of probably going to want to fight another one and conquer someone else, right? Think about in the time of the great wars of ancient Greece, the Peloponnesian War, for example. Alcibiades, the great Athenian general, once said, "We must have more victories, more and more." And that's just kind of the way it goes, but not with Moses or God's people. And thank God for that. Now, it's interesting that they're not bent on war. These things do happen. That's certainly going to be part of the future and the rest of the Old Testament stories, it seems. But they are in for the unexpected, being in the wilderness. Let's read chapter 16 from the top. The whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim, and Israel came into the wilderness of Sin. I might try to say Sin, just to try to keep it separated from the word we use for sin, although there's echoes of that, right? I mean, God does want to set you and I free from our own wilderness of sin or sinful nature or difficulties with that. So the Israelites certainly get some sinful attitude here in just a minute. We'll get to that. But think of it not in that literal way. Sin, or sin, is the root for the word Sinai. where eventually Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai will be named. The original meaning of that Hebrew word is just uncertain, so we just don't have any better English equivalent to give it. But so you may hear me say the wilderness of Sin or Sin. Forgive me for that, but that's what we're doing. Think about it in this context, though, as I read on. Miracles. The people had experienced miracle after miracle. Did they get a little lax about this? Maybe too dependent upon that. Think about what happens here, and let me read. So they're in this wilderness. It's the 15th day of the second month after they had departed. And I think the reason to name the date is to let you know they haven't been a month out of Egypt, okay? God did all of those miracles, the 10 plagues, to set them free. And just a month later, they're saying, verse 3, if only we had died at the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. Oh, Egypt. Yeah, Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. All right, some of you have raised children. Even if you never had children, I'm going to bet that you were a child at one point. And sometimes children complain. Sometimes they're a little bit more testy when they are tired or hungry. There's even a word in our language. Your grandkids can tell you this if you hadn't heard. Don't think I'm making it up. There's a word in our English language today called hangry. You understand what that is? You're so hungry you get angry. And anyway, you'll laugh at that later. They long for the flesh pots of Egypt. Why in the world would they want to go back to Egypt? They don't mention the slavery. These folks in their complaints to Moses and the other leaders, they don't mention the hard work and the brutality of oppression. Dude, what are they thinking of? The food, of course, because, well, people are people, right? It's almost as if, and I've heard somebody who's been through jail say to me, well, at least in jail I had 3 square meals. A roof over your head. You don't have a lot of worries because everything's done for you. So maybe there was something about that for the Exodus, the Egypt experience that they're remembering. Or could it be, as I mentioned, miracles? So I'm having a little fun with human nature and people's, focus on food and water in this story, of course, because they're wandering in the wilderness and there's not much of those things. So I shouldn't be too hard on them. It's understandable. But think about the miracles context. What am I trying to say? Miracles can help people with their faith, but not for long. Why? Because of human nature. God did something great for me. Yeah, but that was last week or that was a month ago that He let us out. Now we have problems today. You ever think that way in your own life? You've prayed before. God has delivered you before. God has provided for you before. But what matters? Today and tomorrow.
Culturally, we haven't changed much.
Right. Dick, that's so true. What he just said is culturally we haven't changed much. Right? The human nature part in our emotionality and in our reactivity, no, we haven't changed much. I love the old saying, can't remember, this was Bible study from 26 years ago. I think her name was Ida, and she had never read the Old Testament, and she was sitting in the parsonage living room with me and about 10 other people when we were reading through these stories, and she said, Pastor, I've never read the Old Testament, but it's just as new as it is old. It's just, in some ways, it's just as relevant. The way people are, the way people were, the way people are. Oh, it's still happening. Yeah. I think that we, like them, might get used to the good things, the blessings that God, or the miracles. They can help build your faith, but only for a short amount of time. Because, I wonder if folks in this Exodus story may have wanted freedom, but then again are struggling with wanting to be taken care of. Do we want true freedom, which means a lot of responsibility? Or would we prefer, in a sense, God to do more and more. That's the problem with miracles as a prerequisite to faith, is that people become dependent and demand more and more. God do more and more for us. But I don't know that God wants to do for us what we can do for ourselves when He equips us, sets us free to do so. We have to take responsibility. But thinking about the food and the anger and the complaint real quick, one other story comes to mind. And if you were with me in Genesis, you might remember this. Jacob and Esau. And the distinction between those two brothers. Esau, man's man, hunter, tough guy. But he traded his birthright for what? A bowl of stew. He was so hungry. It was his physical appetites that were really first and foremost. So, hey, basic needs are necessary. Let's keep reading with understanding. Let me try not to pick on them anymore. With understanding. So they complained to Moses in that first paragraph. Verse 4, the Lord says to Moses, I'm going to rain bread. Wow, that's amazing. If you had never experienced this, you and I, we know the story. But imagine being those people, and this is what they hear. God's going to rain bread from heaven for you. And each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much than they gather on other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord. Well, do they need to remember? It's only been a month. But Exodus really is about remembering. And it's a telling and it's a retelling of the story. And it's told over generations and generations. Okay, so in the evening you shall know it was the Lord. Well, this could be a reminder so that the children or the children's children know God is the one who brought them out. But for those who first heard it, it's important as well. This is another miracle of God's provision. You will know this comes from God. In the evening, you shall see the glory of the Lord. It's a beautiful phrase, the glory of the Lord. Again, it's God's power, it's God's presence, God's provision. All of those things are wrapped up in that word. It's that God is present and able to provide and will do for you what you're not able to do for yourself. In this case, it's the food. By the way, morning and evening, these two parts of the day, which even now I hope you take a minute to look at the sky at sunset or maybe at sunrise. It's easier, it's a short day, so it's kind of easier to catch those and take a moment to be alone with God. If you haven't chosen a devotional book for next year, 2022 will soon be upon you. There's a wonderful book. It's kind of old, 150 years old now or more. Morning and Evening. So it's got, do you have that? Charles Spurgeon, one of my favorites. Such an eloquent preacher from the 1800s in England. He played for a different team than mine. I'm Methodist, he was Baptist, but Congregationalist at least. I think he was Baptist. Charles Spurgeon's Morning and Evening gives you a short devotion, morning and evening. You could even just read one of them, and they're really good. He just unpacks the Scripture with such insights. Love that. All right, let me move on. So basic needs are important. Without basic needs being met, people just don't behave very well. And the rabbis, let me quote one of the rabbis, the mention of the murmurings is evidence of the historic truthfulness of the narratives of the wanderings. A purely ideal picture of the chosen people would have omitted any mention of their complaints. Now, isn't this true? And I make this point a lot. The Bible, I believe, one of the evidences here that the Bible is inspired by God and not merely man-made is because people of faith look so petty and human. We don't see in the Scriptures ways to kind of whitewash or make us look really handsome or beautiful. We're just human. And these are God's chosen people, right? Also, this rabbi mentions the word murmuring. So depending on what translation you read this in, the word complaint is rendered murmurs or murmuring. This is the language in the Gospels where the opponents of Jesus, like the Pharisees, would murmur. They're muttering, they're murmuring, they're complaining. And again, this is good to hear and understand it in that context. Now, verse 4, bread from heaven is manna. Yeah.
Well, the word that you were just saying in this particular version is grumbling.
Grumbling, that's so true. Grumbling. Hey, Christmas time, there are grumpy elves and there's the Grinch, right? So it's this kind of thing where, look, blessings abound. They're in the wilderness. I get it. They're thirsty, they're hungry, they're tired. And one of the things is, even good change, it's difficult. When you move, some of you have just moved here. It's stressful even when it's good. And they didn't come to Ashby Ponds. They came to some wilderness they had never been in before. And there was no place to go to eat, no Great Oak restaurant. So you understand, but change is difficult, even good change. And in verse 4 it says bread from heaven. We're going to talk a lot about this, but let me just go to unpack the word manna real quick while I'm thinking of it. Where did that name come from? In Hebrew, the people said, man who? Manna. It's man who. Two words mean, what's that? Like a child might ask, right? What's that? And so it kind of took its name as a derivative from those two words in the question, what is that? And it's called manna. Not any deep theological meaning there, right? However, I will tell you, as we read into this, I want to connect it with Jesus. We know Jesus said, I am the bread of life. But let's go a little further with this. Oh, it's such wonderful. My professor at Duke would call this intertextuality, where you find woven together words from the Old Testament or one particular book echoed in the New Testament or in another particular book. It's intertextual meaning. And let's weave this together, but let's listen to it for a minute. Verse 8, when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you, let's say, grumble against him. What are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. Now that's Moses and Aaron talking back to them. Remember, people, and it's human nature, we talked about this, human nature really hadn't changed. They're not complaining to God, they're complaining to Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron are saying, hey, who are we? We're just the messengers here. God is in charge, and rightly so. One other thing I think is so important about the Torah, the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament, it does not place Moses too high on a pedestal, or Moses or Aaron, as people who are too close to God or too special for others. So they understand that Moses and Aaron have that humility and try to remind people, this power is not resident in me or in human flesh, but it comes from above, and that's why we call it bread from heaven. And God will be the one to answer that, not we ourselves. We're not making something up or trying to find food for you. We're trusting God. That's what this is all about. So, verse 9, say to the whole congregation, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining. As Aaron spoke to the whole congregation, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, I've heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and you shall know I am the Lord your God. Verse 13, in the evening quails came up and covered the camp. In the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So, speaking of this manna, I've described it, this may not be fair, but in my mind, this is the easiest thing for me to remember. Saltine crackers. Like if you left saltine crackers out on your deck and the dew made them soggy in the morning, it's going to be something like that. Not appetizing? Maybe not. But this was actually, God's miracle, God's provision. And everybody talks about the bread from heaven, but all my years in church, I'd forgotten about the quail. Nobody talks about the quail, right? That's not really part of communion or the way we understand it. But it's fascinating to me how God provides. Let's look again. I want to go back to verse 5. Yeah, this is about God wanting to teach them how to collect it. You'll have twice as much for the Sabbath. So the sixth day, of course, is the day before the Sabbath, the seventh day. And God provides twice as much. But you're supposed to collect it very carefully. So I'm actually going to go down to verse 22, where it connects sixth day. Talking about the Sabbath, I'm not there yet. Actually, verse 18. When they measured it, collecting the manna, it was an omer. So an omer is about 3.5 pounds. Or, basically what I'm going to gain during the week of Christmas. It may not, maybe that sounds like a lot. I don't know. It's just, I would say it's like a humble portion. Now, those who gathered, verse 18, had nothing over. Those who gathered little had no shortage. So if you gather much or you gather little, it's the right amount every time. Yeah, that's the verse I've been looking for. So chapter 16, verse 18, I'm going to connect this intertextual idea I had, with the Lord's Prayer. In the Lord's Prayer, Jesus says, give us our daily bread. And while, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, New Testament is written in Greek, let's just keep it simple there. That particular Greek word just doesn't appear anywhere else in the Scriptures. And for daily bread, that word that Jesus chose, daily bread. I'm thinking it's an echo of the bread of heaven, that you get precisely what you need. All right, so if you're a person who doesn't need a lot of calories in one day, you're going to get your daily bread. Or if you're a family that's got a lot of hungry mouths, you're going to get fill enough for you, your children, everybody in your care. God will provide in that way, such that we don't pray for, Lord, give me 5 days of bread, or give me enough that I could hoard up or that I could overconsume, or what have you. It's also an echo of Proverbs, where there's this wonderful proverb, I think it's chapter 30, give me neither riches nor poverty, right? So give me precisely what I need. And that's a way of reminding us that through the Scriptures and through Jesus, God teaches us to be content with what God provides. Not more than I really need is probably the meaning of the phrase daily bread. Lord, give me not more than I really need today, but to trust you one day at a time. That's the point of the manna, is that you don't get so much that you can be overconfident or be prepared for the whole week even. Yeah, it's one day at a time. Trust God. Also, I think it's a wonderful beginning. All of these are experiences of beginning anew. National identity is being formed. A covenant community is being formed. God is saying it's the bread, but it's also trusting me so that you'll follow my instructions, my ways. Let me teach you my ways. And so, care for food equity, making sure that everyone has what they need, is part of the new way of being in the world that's so different from the Egypt that they left. So there's all sorts of things going on in this idea of the manna, the daily bread, the bread of heaven, the bread of life. Think about Jesus. By the way, it's almost Christmas. Where was Jesus born? Quick pop quiz. You didn't know this was coming, but I think you're ready. Where was Jesus born? The little town? Bethlehem. What does that mean? House of bread. House of bread. God provides. God provides exactly what we need. So this manna must be handled very carefully. It's available in the morning, so it's just for that same day. On the sixth day, that's Friday, before the sun goes down, then it becomes the Sabbath at sunset. They would have to be prepared, so they won't work on the Sabbath. So what you find here is the Sabbath is constituted. We haven't even gotten to the Ten Commandments yet, but understand it's prefigured in a number of places. You might think, hey, 7 days of creation, right? Even God took a day off. So take a day off. I know I'm talking mostly to retired people, but have you ever found yourself still doing so much of the same things? When I was first in ministry, I was out in the country while I was a student at Duke, but we were near the Carolina border. And I remember sitting with this farm couple, and he was telling me about how he retired. And she laughed at him, but also gave him a little swat on the elbow, like, He retired, not me. I'm still doing the same things I've always done. Cleaning the house, cooking meals for him, doing the laundry. You know, this whole litany of things that she was doing. And she wasn't complaining about it, but you think about whatever it is that in our daily routine, we're so busy, even in retirement, maybe, so busy. When do you take time to be holy and set aside time for God? So Sabbath keeping is very important in our day and time as well, because we can be, well, just so creatures of habit, doing our routine without thinking about honoring the Lord. So, I'm checking my notes here. I don't want to miss something. There's one thing I wanted to share with you. Talking about God's glory, God's presence and power. This is also a story for us not to look simply to our own appetites. You know, thinking, oh, hey, God is taking care of me. I don't, really have to worry about God anymore until I'm hungry again. No. Think about your problems, too. Quite often we're praying to God for our current problems, which is the right thing to do. But often Christians might say a prayer like this: Lord, how can I get out of this? How can I get this to work out? Rather, we might better off pray, Lord, what can I get out of this? If we're in these difficult circumstances, what can we learn? How can we look to the Lord anew? And the manna, or these needs that they faced in the wilderness, certainly were these regular ways of learning. So the Bible uses the word test. And, I've had people come to me in Bible studies or after Sunday mornings quite often and say, does God test people? Well, yes and no. I would say, think about what you mean by the word test. Because my view of God, through the witness of all the Scriptures, not just one, but thinking through Jesus and the way God has come to us through grace more than anything else, think about the word teaching instead of test. Because all of my effective teachers, and I came up through public school education, went through a number of institutes of higher learning and so on. I don't disparage them or think they were being mean by giving me a test. It was a way for me to help myself understand that I had actually learned something, because I put it into an application, a test procedure, whatever that looked like in different ways. So the test is not some sort of mean-spirited thing, or I don't think of God as, with a lightning bolt in his right hand, peering over your shoulder, breathing down your neck, ready to catch you doing something wrong. Some people do think of God that way. I don't think it's really helpful. By the way, I don't know how it is in your church, but in my church we sing a song called Amazing Grace, not Amazing Guilt, or some sort of negative judgment. Thank God for tests that help us to learn. So another person had said it to me, if you like this better. This is just the way life is. Life gives you the tests first, and the lessons come later. You understand? It's like you go through problems, and then you look back and say, well, I did learn something. I was able to grow through that. So pray, Lord, what can I get out of this? Not how can I get out of this. What can I get? What are you teaching me through this current wilderness experience, whatever that might be for you? I'm going to keep reading on. We were at verse 18. So the Israelites, verse 17, they did as God had commanded. I mean, he's providing them food. Verse 18, they measured it with an omer. They gathered as much as they needed. Verse 19, let no one leave any of it over. Now, here's the other thing. It doesn't keep. So again, it's part of the practice of trusting God one day at a time. And of course, someone's not going to listen. Verse 20, they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till morning. It bred worms, became foul. They probably didn't do that more than once. That's gross, not helpful, not healthy. But here's the point I want to get to. Verse 20, the end of it. Moses was angry. Well, here we go again with the humanization of Moses is important. From the beginning to this part in the story as well, we see Moses as an ordinary person, someone who has the same struggles that you do. And he's kind of growing impatient with the people. And we're going to hear more about that in chapter 18. But I just wanted to name that again. God, through these scriptures, teaches us not to venerate Moses too much. And it's really God who gets all the credit here. Morning by morning, they gathered it as much as they needed. When the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest." So here is really the formation of Sabbath practice even before the commandment comes. A holy Sabbath to the Lord, Shabbat or Sabbath in Hebrew, it literally means to cease. So what I had suggested earlier is, you and I, you may not be working, but you and I are called of God to cease something, to set aside time to be holy with the Lord. And you can interpret that in our day and time as you will, but it needs to be something that you let go of or stop doing intentionally. Verse 24, they put it aside till morning. Moses commanded them, and it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. So there, obvious, very specific instructions for taking care with the bread from heaven. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you gather it. On the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none." So again, the repetition is to remind people. This is a teaching tool. And I'm just reminding you, it's, the Bible, particularly in the Torah, and these are examples, is not always written in strict chronological order. So you can imagine generation after generation, they get real specific to try to help the children, the great-grandchildren and so on, to understand it and to remember. This is about trusting God. Every person in every time, trust God every day. That's the lesson. Sometimes they're still disobedient. Verse 27, the 7th day, some of the people still went out to gather, and they found none. The Lord said, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? See, the Lord has given you a Sabbath. Therefore, 6 days he gives you food for 2 days on the 6th day. Each of you stay where you are and do not leave your place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. So again, sort of the reiteration of the Sabbath instructions and how much it takes, to convince people to be able to trust God and to follow their instruction. When I mentioned Moses getting angry, we certainly see this time and again in the story of Moses. For me, it's another evidence of the hand of God moving the hand of people to write these things down because of the capacity of self-critique. I mentioned this in a different Bible study. I wanted to use that phrase again for you. The Scriptures, and this is, I would suggest, unique to our Holy Bible. When you read sacred Scriptures in other religions, you don't get this. But the capacity for self-critique is an inherent part of Scripture that helps us to know God does desire for people to be humble, to be honest, to do self-correction, honest look at who Moses is, a person with his own emotional reactivity and problems. God's going to send a helper to him here in the next chapter or two. He can't handle all this. And the people and how sinful they are, how quickly they run to disobedience, or how quickly after God has saved them, do they turn and start complaining and have a bitter attitude. They are in the wilderness of sin, right? It's not just a place, it's a human experience. But the Bible does not whitewash the truth about us as people. I think if the Bible were simply created by human beings, then we would have been a lot easier on ourselves, right? But there's some deep truth to be taught here. I don't want you to miss that. The other part is the Sabbath teaching. See, I covered that. I want to go one other place here as we're wrapping up. We've got time. Wrapping up chapter 16. Oh, it's interesting. Let's read the last part. What verse do I want to start on? That paragraph that starts on verse 31. So the house of Israel, it's an interesting phrase, house of Israel. Don't usually, children of Israel is much more frequent. But that's an interesting phrase. They called it manna. It was like coriander seed. They would have been familiar with that type of seed in their area. White, the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. All of a sudden, the soggy saltines sound better when you add honey. That's good. Verse 32, Moses said, "This is what the Lord commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations." What is happening? Okay, Like I said, it's not written in strict chronological order. The manna from heaven that basically has been explained like it's not going to last till tomorrow. Now somehow you're going to save it for generations. All right, just let's work with God. Let's go with this. Let me read it. All right, keep it, at least this is what, 3.5 pounds of it, so that your successive generations can see the food with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. So this is obviously future set. But here's what happened next. Take a jar, verse 33. Put the manna in it, place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. The Lord commanded Moses. So Aaron placed it in the covenant. I don't know what your translation might say in your Bible, but it's the Ark of the Covenant. We're not there yet in the Old Testament story. So this is something that happens later. But what was the Ark of the Covenant for? Well, this was, God's holy presence resided there. This was the place where they would put the original 10 Commandments when they were sent by email. That's not true. Maybe they're sent on stone. So, think about this. This was a collection. The covenant, or the Ark of the Covenant, became a holy receptacle for these relics, these holy, and I'm teasing with this a little bit. No disrespect to God. What I'm trying to say is, isn't this interesting? Trying to teach their children's children's children to remember. This whole book is about remembering rightly. And the idea that Moses and Aaron would save some of this as proof. Okay? Because I don't know, we're what? One generation, 20 years since 9/11 and that terrible day in American history, and so many people lost their lives. And there are young people today who think it never happened. So every generation comes along and needs to know this actually happened. Yes, God fed us with bread from heaven, and so keep some of it. So we can understand sort of the need, the desire to do this, to try to prove. I almost want to preach a sermon on that for a minute. I'll try to be very brief. But I think there is a theme going on here that I haven't given enough attention to, that talking about an Exodus journey, talking about freedom, God created us from the beginning with free will so that we could choose, even as people of faith, even those who have received the blessing of abundant miracles like these Israelites, right? You still could choose to trust God or not. You still can choose to believe God or not. Some, even with all the evidence, refuse to think that there is some higher power or great creator, benevolent God, supreme being, whatever you want to call him. Because God has given us free will. And for some who are disbelievers all along, no evidence would be proof enough. And for some of us who just run on faith, we've been perhaps brought up with faith, and all along you and I, some of us, we can just look outside and say, I see a miracle. Just the sunlight, just the trees, whatever the air feels like today, I breathe it in and I think about that original breath of God. Breath of God. Got caught in my throat somehow. That breath of God that was with Adam and Eve, that God's very presence. For me, who was it? Einstein, who said, there's just two ways to look at the world. As if nothing is a miracle, or as if everything is a miracle. And I choose to believe that. But you have the choice. You have the choice to believe. So the other way I've put it, and we talked about this with the bitter water at the end of the last chapter that had to be transformed to make it drinkable water. It's the same with our hearts or with our attitudes. We can either get better or grow bitter. And in the wilderness, in these different things they faced, some of the people were just choosing to get bitter and complain and not to trust God. But God always gives us this choice, and I just think that's a beautiful thing. Verse 35, they ate manna for 40 years. I just circled that on my sheet. I wanted you to know why. Is it punishment? Well, here they are wandering in the wilderness. They are only a month or so out of Egypt. But it takes more than a generation or two to get the Egypt out of the people. So it took God a certain amount of time to get the people out of Egypt, but it's going to take God a lot longer to get the Egypt out of people. What do I mean, the Egypt? Well, for the flesh pots of they longed for what was familiar. They longed for whatever comfort. You ever thought about this? The past looks so good now. Why? Because what you remember are just the good things. And of course it looks like the glory days, because today, what are you thinking about? The fire that's at your feet, the problems you face today that you didn't have back then. So it makes the past, anxiety distorts memory. And that's part of the story of the wilderness wanderings, is that it's human nature. Anxiety distorts memory. This book of Exodus, and it's so repetitive, and it's so, it fills in so many details on some things and not details on the other. That's true about the Bible. It frustrates me sometimes. But it's trying to teach us, look to the Lord, and remember, 40 years. The Egypt that had to be exorcised from the people, what they still had to be set free from, was their attitudes. The Egypt within, the mindset, the difficulties of a depressed and demoralized people, all this long while proving them day after day that God was with them with manna from heaven and the meat from the quail that came also in the evening. This was a way of God working a slow and deliberative transformation on the hearts of the people. It's all about teaching trust and forming an identity of a new people who would be a covenant community, trusting God through everything. All right, we're almost done, but I do want to touch on 17. So over the next couple of weeks, you can read into this and think a little bit about 17. We'll pick up around here 2 weeks from now. But it's interesting. I'm not going to read the story. I'm going to just tell you some thoughts about it. Immediately, the people are asking, isn't the Lord with us or not? It's verse 7 of chapter 17. Is the Lord among us or not? They continue to quarrel. They continue to complain. This time, again, no water. So there are 4 crises, if you're keeping score at home. First one was no water in the wilderness. They found bitter water at Marah. The second one was just this. We want the flesh pots of Egypt because we're starving, so God gives them manna. The third one we're coming on to at the beginning of chapter 17. Again, no water. The fourth crisis of these 4 in a row will be a war. So the Amalekites. So let's look at this first paragraph of chapter 17. This is where God tells Moses to go ahead of the people and strike the rock with your staff. But let's focus on the people here. They're wondering, is God with us? Now, isn't this interesting? Part of the theme, or a subplot, if you will, in this Exodus story is the wilderness wanderings itself, or how people respond in what seems like God-forsaken circumstances. Maybe you've been through, maybe you and I, we've never been stranded out in the middle of the Moab desert or something in an actual wilderness, but we've been through wilderness wanderings in our own lives. Those experiences where you wonder, is God with me now or not? Did I lose sight of God or leave His path in such a way that God has left me? I can tell you, that poem, Footprints. I mean, God never leaves us, right? We may look back and say, there's just one set of footprints in the sand, Lord, where were you? He said, I was carrying you, right? You understand this idea that God never leaves us. But there are experiences that may lead us to believe. Have I done something wrong? Am I being punished? Where is God in all of this? Faithful people ask these questions. And so they're going through this. And I'd invite you to read the rest of Exodus in that regard, trying to understand how are people keeping faith or finding God present with them in these wilderness times or experiences where we feel abandoned, feel that circumstances in our life are chaotic or without order, where sometimes it's the reliable support systems that we often lean on. Maybe they've been taken away from us. One person has called it living in a liminal space. Liminal may not be a word that we use very often, but it's an in-between, or it's the same word for threshold. in Latin. Liminal is like you're right on the edge of something that's about to become good, but you're not there yet. So you've left something behind. The familiar is no longer around you, but you're not sure what you're getting into, what you're walking into. If you've ever been married, there could be an example. Not picking on marriage. I'm just saying, when you first get married, you don't know really what's coming. Or when you have children, you don't really know. How's that going to work out for you? You've got to live into it for a while. In this liminal space, or this in-between time for the people of Israel in these chapters, well, it's in between bondage and well-being. Somewhere in between their former life of Egypt and their future life as the people of God living into the promised land. They're just not there yet. So think about this. This is a way, it takes a long time and a lot of different experiences, not all of them good, but it's a way of God doing some nation building, some new identity formation, and some faith growing. And is God doing any faith growing in your life? That might be something to look for over these next weeks. All right, as you read on, think about that coming war with the king Amalek, and how Moses uses his staff. I mean, that's still, I think, a fascinating subplot that's going on here. The function of water and the shepherd's staff in these experiences. I'm gonna leave it on that cliffhanger. Hope to see you after Christmas. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all those good things.